Welcome to our second module in the Introduction to English Language Learners and WIDA course. This module is entitled Language Acquisition and Academic Language Development. And in this module we're going to be focusing on how languages are learned, first and second languages, and then how we can apply this sort of acquisitional knowledge to the academic setting in our work with students in the classroom. Alright, so as we get started, let's take a little quiz here, just for fun, on how much we already know about English language learners in America. Just answer the questions in your head as we go through. So, 1 in how many public school students in K-12 right now comes from a home where a language other than English is spoken? The answer is actually 1 in 9. In 1990, the figure was only 1 in 20. And by 2025, it's expected to be what? 1 in how many? The answer is most likely 1 in 4 students will be from a second language background, coming in from a home language that's other than English. Third question, between 1990 and 2005, we had an increase from 2 to how many million students that speak another language in the home? It's about 150% increase. The increase was 20% in the general K-12, and it was a large increase in South Carolina and some other states in the South especially. So, an increase from 2 to 5 million students. And it's even increasing from that point as well in the past decade. Question 4. It takes between blank and blank years to learn English. This is a bit of a trick question, but really we're talking here more about academic English. The social English we would expect a student to get in maybe 2 to 3 years, but as we talk more about academic English, between 5 and 7, and actually some research suggests that it could be up to a decade to learn English academically in the school setting. Last question is a question about acronyms. What do the following acronyms stand for? ESOL, ELL, and LEP. ESOL stands for English to Speakers of Other Languages, and is synonymous with the term ELL, which means English Language Learner. And LEP stands for Limited English Proficient, which is another way of describing students in our ESOL or ELL program. So really these are all 3 acronyms that mean the same thing. And I tell people, if it's got an E in it, that's us. So let's reflect for a second on your own experience of learning another language. When and where did you learn it? Was it in school? Was it from your family? From your parents or grandmother perhaps? How did you learn it? Was it book learning? Was it social learning? Was it listening to the radio or watching TV? And how well did you really learn to read and write in that language? Or did you just learn to speak and listen? Or occasionally, some people only really learn to listen to the language and really can't even speak it or produce much of it. What factors influenced your second language learning? And what do you think could have helped you to master the language more effectively? Are there some resources that were missing that might have really helped you in understanding how to better speak and understand that language? So as we think about ourselves in this experience, we need to now shift our attention to what it's like to be an ESOL student learning the language of English. And in the learning of a language, whether it was you and your language or an ESOL student coming here to America to learn English, there's many factors that are involved in influencing the student in their learning of language. 3 major categories are the language background, the internal factors of the learner, and also the external learning process. So if you look at each one of these in detail, under language background, we need to know how distant the home language or the L1 is from English. Languages like German, our sister language, or Romance languages like Italian, French, or Spanish are going to be much easier for students to learn thanks to cognates from Greek and Latin roots. Another language, like Vietnamese from Asia, is a tonal language, but they still use the same script as we use, so there might be some ability to transfer knowledge there. Or it might be as distant from English as Chinese or Japanese. And those languages obviously use a completely different script in their writing, which requires a lot more of a student to learn as they approach the English language. And then when we think about what kind of level and type of language one proficiency did they have? Were they schooled in their language? Do they have a lot of academic background they're bringing in? Or or are they pretty low with lots of gaps in their learning anyways? And so the gaps in their first language are obviously going to affect their second language development. What's their previous experience and knowledge of English? Did they have a couple of courses in their school like we have Spanish 1 and Spanish 2 in our schools? Or were they completely fluent in English before they came and just need a little bit of polishing up? Or because of gaps in language or language instruction or general educational instruction, do they really need a lot of help because they really have had no experience with English beyond maybe a couple simple phrases? And then it's also important to consider the language 1 status in the community. How does that student's home language factor in the community? Is it a prestige language, or is it a language that's seen as more a language of the poor or common people? And that sort of impact is going to be felt as a student is learning English coming from their background. So internally, inside the learner, we have a couple of factors, like the motivation. What kind of motivation do they have to learn English? And what's their attitude towards it? Do they feel like they can do it, or do they feel discouraged and they can't do it? Their age plays a role, and also their developmental level mentally. It doesn't matter exactly what age you are, because everyone at any age can learn a new language, but the different ages that students are at when we approach them with the learning of English, it's going to help us to know how the age factors into their style of learning and what cognitive level they're at the current time. So any student can learn English, whether from kindergarten to 12th grade or even an adult. It's just we need to take that into consideration when we are working with them to provide the most productive assistance for them. Their personality and their aptitude towards languages is also very important. Some students just naturally love to converse in another language, and they learn oftentimes much more quickly than a student who's more reserved. And some students, we just say, are just great at language, and they can seem to pick up what other students can't get, they can get quite quickly. And are there other disabilities or challenges that the student faces that might also come into play as they're learning the English language? The final category is the learning process. These are external things that would factor into a student's learning. What's their access to English instruction? How many times a day are they in a class specifically targeting their English? And the second thing might be the quality of instruction. Throughout the school day, when they are with us at the school in their classes, what kind of quality instruction are we providing? Is it solid, or is it bits and pieces where the student maybe is not getting all the language practice that they really could? And then beyond these things, there's also the idea of how much time the student interacts with English outside of the school setting. Sometimes students spend very little time in English after they leave and get off the bus, and other students would spend quite a bit of their day in English depending on that student's situation. So this obviously is a very complicated chart, but we're going to use it just to give you a basic overview of the different stages of language acquisition. So if you look down the first column on the left, you'll see the different stages from numbers 1 through 5. The numbers 1 through 5 correlate with the access test that's given every spring to tell us the level of a student's English. Level 1 is what we call a newcomer or a pre-functional student. And they're going to be able to have a very minimal level of comprehension and production of language, and usually anywhere between the first 0 to 6 months, and even could extend up to the first year of their being here. There's also some teacher prompts that would be some great things for you to include as you're working with these students. Level 2 is a beginner, and this student has, again, very limited comprehension, but they're able to start producing language more than a newcomer or pre-functional student can. Students can enter this phase as early as 6 months, but usually it's more around a year and lasts until about their second year. And again, some teacher prompts for you to consider. Level 3 is intermediate level. The student's comprehension is definitely growing, and the production includes simple sentences where you really feel like you can have a conversation with these students. They're, of course, going to make lots of grammatical and pronunciation errors, but the student now is at a place where you're feeling more confident in having a conversation that they're actually understanding and interacting back with you. The time frame here could be anywhere between 1.5 years of learning English all the way to their 4th year. And you'll notice there's overlaps in times here because, again, the fact that students learn at different levels and different paces. Level 4 is the advanced level. This student has excellent comprehension and tends to make fewer grammatical errors as they talk, and maybe will produce more as they write, however. Students at this level usually get challenged by teachers by saying, "You speak English just fine. Why can't you do this work?" Because really what the student has not had enough time is to really master that academic language They've been here probably 3 to 5 years, and they still do need some help. They still need some work, and maybe the work they need is a little bit harder to dig into and understand because of the fact that it's mostly dealing with their reading and writing abilities. And then level 5, we're getting to a student here that's what we call bridging or near fluent. They're about to get to the pace of what we feel an average English-speaking student would be at that grade level. Their near native abilities in speaking, listening, reading, and writing. There, of course, may be some accent depending on when a student started learning English, but the accent doesn't affect their understanding, and it doesn't affect your understanding of them either. And the time frame here could be between 5 and 7 years, and as I've said earlier, some research suggests that it might even take up to a decade for a student to get all the way to this level of English acquisition. So, for your individual activity for this session, it's going to be sort of started now and then completed by the time that this module comes to a close. And so what you'll have to do is to create yourself a KWLH chart. It doesn't have to be fancy. There's one example that you can use on the Module 2 files that are attached to the class. Or you can just pull out a piece of paper and fold it with 3 lines so you make a chart like this. And at the top you can put KWLH. And what we want you to do on this chart is keep it as you're listening to the rest of the module and just complete it as we go. It's a good mind map to get your mind thinking about this idea of academic language. So, first off, in the K category, think about and write the things right now that you already know about academic language. And then also the W column, what do you want to know about academic language by the time you finish this module number 2? So then, take a few moments to do that now, and jot down as you're going through the rest of this seminar what you are learning about academic language, and then at the very end you can have some time to go back and reflect on how you actually learned the content about academic language to help you consider how you might also help other students to learn academic language in your content area. So feel free to pause this as you're making your KWLH chart and completing the K and W sections. Okay, so as we begin to define academic language, we need to really compare it with another form of language we've mentioned previously called conversational language or social language. This conversational language we can call BICS, which means Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills. It's also known as Playground English or Social English. This is a language that's embedded in a very rich context with a high desire for students to communicate in it, and also there's a lot of supports and scaffolds that help them to learn this language much more quickly than academic language. The topics of discussion here are usually not very cognitively demanding, and if they are, there's a lot of context to help the students to understand. So comparing this with academic language, which is also called CALP, Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, here we're talking about language ability that's required for academic achievement in the context-reduced environment of the academic classroom. It's more cognitively demanding, and it's often very abstract. And we also find there's very few clues as to the meaning of the communication apart from the words themselves. Alright, you'll see a link here to a YouTube clip called ESL Bob, and this video is a 3-minute little film about the difference between BICS and CALP, the two different kinds of language. So I challenge you to pause the recording for just a minute to watch this 3-minute video and ask yourself the question, what are the differences between everyday conversational language and academic language? So feel free to pause the recording now to watch this YouTube video. You can easily search it on YouTube. Alright, so as we take a little chance to use a technique of how to teach a vocabulary word to students in your classes, you may be familiar with the 4 corners model, or sometimes called the Frere model. In the first box, you want to include an illustration or a description of the word and also the word itself. In the second box, you want to have an example or a sentence with an embedded definition. In the third box, we include a definition, put it in our own words, in the student's words. In the fourth box, we include a misconception or what the word is not. Sometimes an antonym would suffice. So if you look at academic language in this 4-square model, we see that the BICS, if it's represented as the top of the iceberg, the CALP or the academic language is what's submerged under the water, which is again a much larger proportion than that BICS language. Number 2 has a sample sentence of how a student might write about what academic language is, And the third box includes a definition that the student feels like what academic language is to them. Here they say, the academic vocabulary, language functions, and grammar that students need to comprehend and demonstrate the knowledge of in their subject matters. In the fourth box, a student might write something like a misconception like this. Academic language is not just vocabulary, and of course it's much more than that, as we'll continue to see throughout this module. So another little chance to give you the difference in BICS and CALP. I want you to read these questions with me, and we'll try to tell which ones represent BICS, which is the social language, or CALP, the academic language. Number 1 says, a student asks permission to see the nurse. Number 2, a student describes what he or she did over the weekend during the circle time. Number 3, a student writes a paragraph comparing and contrasting a rectangle and a parallelogram. Number 4, a student is able to understand a movie about a futuristic event. Number 5, a student asks for clarification in math class. Number 6, a student describes his or her favorite president, providing examples from his life and work. Number 7, a student is able to understand a lecture on photosynthesis. And number 8, a student is able to write a letter of apology to another student. So could you determine which one of these were BICS and which one of these were CALP? Number 1 was BICS, number 2, and number 8. And the rest were all examples of cognitive academic language proficiency. Alright, let's keep moving. Okay, and as we continue to learn more about the WIDA standards framework, we'll move through these different funnels down to the point where we'll actually be doing a lot of practical work on things that you'll actually be doing on a day in, day out basis in your classes and working with students. But right now, let's spend a little more time on the theoretical aspects of the features of academic language, and later, in another module, we'll move into performance definitions and what those mean, and then finally, in Module 6, to the standards matrix. So, as we look at the features of academic language in the WIDA standards, we'll notice in this chart that they're described in 3 different levels: discourse level, sentence level, and word level. The discourse level is the linguistic complexity that a student is able to understand and perform at, to both use and understand. Here we're talking about a paragraph or an essay if we're talking about writing, or perhaps a speech if we're talking about speaking and listening. At the sentence level, we're really involved with the language forms and conventions. These are the criteria we'll be looking at. And here, we're looking at how students put sentences together and their clauses and different parts. How good is their grammar? And how does it fit in with them making meaning using the English language? And then finally, that builds all of these other aspects, these other levels, is the word and phrase level. And here we're talking about vocabulary usage. The specificity of words or phrases and the choices that students make, and the words that create the phrases that create the sentences to build the discourses, are the things we're going to be talking about. And notice that, as you see at the very bottom of the screen, that all of these 3 levels of academic language operate within a socio-cultural context that includes some of the things at the bottom. The register of language, which you can see as BICS versus CALP, the genre and text type, the topic under discussion for that day, the task and the situation, and also the participants' identities and social roles within that context. So, if I were to give you a little quiz about translating these 2 sentences from German into English, I feel like you could translate letter A pretty well. What do you think it says? You may have guessed it correctly that it says, "My mother is intelligent." But if I challenge your thinking a little bit by giving you sentence B, I think here you'll have a little bit harder time figuring out what the sentence is actually saying. So take a moment to see if you can figure out what sentence B is talking about. You'll notice some of the same words and some cognates if you say them, like wenn, sounds like when. And there's a lot of things that might help you understand the sentence, but there's obviously some things in there that are going to be very challenging. And this sentence actually says, well, actually I'm not going to tell you, because that's how it feels a lot of times to be an ESL student, being given very challenging language, to understand some of it, but then the teacher goes right on past and leaves you're half understanding in the dust. So, very sorry. You'll have to use Google Translate to figure that one out. You may have heard it said that math is universal language. But actually, that's not true at all. It's true that the numerals that we commonly use now are understood around the world, but the language of math in a math classroom is far from a bunch of symbols and numbers and grunting. We use words, sentences, and discourse level conversation every day in math class. So let's take a brief look at this chart that shows us about the different aspects of the language of math and the three different areas that we've talked about before. At the word and phrase level, what we're talking about here is the semantics and the meanings of words. Students need to be able to know the definitions of words that they're going to encounter in the text, whether it's the content words or just the words that surround, for example, in a word problem. They need to also understand that words can mean different things based on the context. And they need to have the ability to translate using an online translator, a dictionary, or the help of a peer. When we look at the sentence level, here in math we're talking about syntax. Phrases and sentences such as 3 is greater than n, or if n is greater than 5, then etc., etc. There's lots of sentence level work here when we talk about clauses and phrases being put together into meaningful sentences that students need to understand as they approach the math class, listening to the teacher, speaking back to a teacher or other students about the content, being able to read a test, and also to be able to perform writing exercises that might be involved with that math. And then if we expand from there at the discourse level, we see mathematical discourse is when students are going to have to do more extensive reading and writing. Could be an introduction to a chapter that includes a whole paragraph of text to explain a new point. It's obviously very cognitively demanding, and it uses many specific linguistic functions like persuading or arguing or hypothesizing. So as students build their level of math content knowledge, they're also going to be building their level of math language knowledge. And it's not just a universal thing. If you think about different kinds of math vocabulary, there are different kinds of words that we'll see within a math class. It could be a contextual word, which could be a difficult vocab word that describes a real-world context of a word problem. Or it could be a content word. And these are the quote-unquote math words and phrases that you're traditionally used to teaching that none of the students are going to know in class. But the functional words, such as your action verbs and things that are connected to cognitive tasks, might be words that your average English speaker will obviously understand, but that an ESL student or another struggling learner might just not be aware of what that word means or how to use it in a context. So we need to expand our view of the vocabulary that we're using and expecting from students, understanding the different components of different kinds of vocabulary, and then using that knowledge to help our students to build on where they start at to get them to a level of being able to meet content and grade level expectations. The feeling you have from looking at a word problem this complicated is probably the feeling that an ESL student has when they look at a word problem that you would see as quite simple. Maybe a 1 or 2 sentence word problem to you would be something that you would assume everyone understands, but really it's quite difficult for an ESL student considering the fact that they still haven't built the contextual vocabulary or the functional vocabulary needed to understand the content vocabulary that you're trying to teach. You'll actually notice in this word problem that there really isn't a lot of the content vocabulary. It's a lot of contextual and functional words, including things dealing with money and ages and different issues with family like siblings and the age of siblings. And even though there's not a lot of content knowledge in here, this is a very demanding question in how it's constructed, and in how it's written is very important to us for us to realize that we can sometimes provide a more difficult situation for a student in the way that we say something or write something, when actually maybe there's a better way of explaining it that wouldn't be so demanding using all those contextual and functional words. So if you'd like to pause this and figure out the answer, and you want to tell your instructor what you think the answer is, that person will give you a large sum of money. We don't really have time to talk about the question and the answer now, but it's definitely a stumper. That last word problem was a real stumper. in some ways because of the complexity of the sentences and word choices that were used, but also in the sense of the difficulty of the cognitive task that was being asked of a student to answer the problem. If you see this chart here, what we're looking at is the cognitive tasks, the academic language, and the proficiency of that academic language, and how it helps us in the functions, forms, and fluency categories. So let's look at it really quickly. If we have a cognitive task, for example, the question on the last page, that was trying to help us to synthesize and draw conclusions about information, we're going to need to have a certain level of academic language in order to master that task. That might include the language that's written in the words of the question. We might understand the style of writing. Was it an expository text structure or something else? We need to also understand the syntax and how we construct sentences in order to make sure that we've actually understood what the question is even asking us to do. That includes grammatical features like parts of speech and tense and mood and subject and verb agreements. And also, there might be academic vocabulary involved that we might need to make sure we understand to be sure we fully understand what the question is even asking us. And for a beginner ESL student, as you can obviously tell, a question like that would be virtually impossible because of the fact that their fluency, their proficiency in English is so low. And as they grow and develop in their ability to speak English and produce that academic language, their proficiency grows, they become more accurate and fluent in using the language. It's more easy for them to comprehend and produce. It becomes more automatic. They speak in words in ways that are appropriate to the style of the discourse they're a part of. And they can also use the language for a wide range of purposes. So again, to think back on that last question that was asked about the silver coins, students need to be growing in their proficiency and their fluency of English while building that academic language to help them to build the forms and structure for being able to accomplish the cognitive tasks and the functions that we want them to accomplish in classes. So taking all these little bits and pieces into consideration is very important for us in understanding how to best work with these students to provide them work on a level they can understand to really excel. This chart is here to show us an academic language grid. And if we consider our various content areas, such as mathematics, science, or social studies, we see that each of these different content areas is requiring different sorts of language functions, language forms, and academic vocabulary. So let's look at the three columns here to understand how they might play a role in teaching academic language to ESL students. The one column reading language functions is asking the question of what students are being asked to do with the language. Do they need to define, predict, compare, or analyze? These are oftentimes the Bloom's taxonomy words that can help us to see what we want students to be understanding or producing. And then the language forms. These are the grammatical forms and the structures that the students are going to need to accomplish those language functions. Do they need to understand phrasal verbs, comparatives and superlatives, such as funny, funnier, funniest, or verb tenses? These are all important components in being able to perform the language functions that we're asking of them. And then, as if they were the building blocks, the academic vocabulary in the final column are either the generalized academic words or the content-specific vocabulary that students really need to access the content. Some of these general academic words will be seen across mathematics, science, and social studies, but oftentimes they can also be specific. For example, quotient most likely would only be in a mathematics class, and velocity and investigate might be more of a science class. And then policy and culture, more of a social studies. But a word like range could perhaps be in many of the different categories like math, science, or social studies. So, as we transition into our final topic for this module, we want to talk about objectives. So consider these questions with me as we look into the difference between a content objective and a language objective. So what is a content objective? How would you describe it? And then how would it be different from a language objective? And the third question would be, what is the purpose of having both a language and a content objective for each day in your classroom? How is that going to help students? Again, not just ESOL learners, but also any other student who might be a struggling learner. Well, this page here is going to show us the difference between content and language objectives. A content objective would be asking a student to know or to do something, and these are often involving the concepts and or the skills that you see as the most important things you need to teach students so they can meet the standards of your class. For an ELL, we really need to help students by focusing on the most essential of these objectives. We also need to simplify the wording, but not necessarily the content, and we need to chunk things as best as possible to give students the time and the ability to really perform well on the things we're asking them to either know or do. And then the other side of the page is asking us about language objectives. And here, this is how you're going to ask a student to show you what they know or what they can do. These, of course, are going to use academic language receptively, which is listening and reading, things that are going to enter into the student, or expressively through speaking and writing, which are going to leave the student to be heard by an audience. For ELLs in particular, we really need to provide a lot of scaffolding support in these language objectives. We can use things like sentence frames. For example, an estuary has blank water, but an ocean has blank water. Being able to scaffold a student's language objectives and understanding that a student might not be able to say what they know or can do until we make it accessible for them. So something as simple as a sentence frame can really show us that a student understands the content objective, but we've given them some supports with the language objective to make sure that we know what they can really know and do, and they've shown it to us. So, this is a little analysis of our language. What language does a student need to make predictions on the states of matter with a partner? For example, this is an objective we might give to our class. So, making predictions on states of matter with a partner. The forms and conventions might require them to use the future tense. For example, I predict the ice will melt, etc., etc. The vocabulary usage might include words like liquid, solid, gas, and states of matter. And the linguistic complexity would include the uses of expanded clauses. For example, I predict that the ice will melt when exposed to, etc., etc. So taking the three components of the different kinds of academic language from the bottom at vocab usage up to forms and conventions and finally to linguistic complexity, we've moved through a quick analysis of what a student would need in order to show us that they can accomplish the objective in the middle of the page, which is making predictions on states of matter with a partner. And notice we include with a partner, giving us another example of a support structure to help out our students. Here's a couple of sample language objectives. Let's look at them briefly. The first one says, students will use the future tense to make predictions in the change of states of matter. And here, we're including what tense we want students to speak in, and the content, which is going to be making predictions about change of matter. And here's another language objective. Students will produce expanded sentences using clauses to make predictions of this change in states of matter. So notice again that our content is the same. We're trying to make predictions about the changes in the states of matter. But here, our language objective is different. We want students to produce expanded sentences using clauses to make these predictions. Our first language objective was a simpler version for a student who's probably at a lower level of English proficiency, and our second language objective is asking for a more detailed explanation using higher levels of vocabulary, higher levels of sentences, and obviously the expansion of those sentences using the clauses that are asked for. Notice again that the content and the standard is not changed. The mental requirements for the student to perform this are still there, but we're scaffolding them in such a way with these language objectives so we can really know what they know and what they can do. We're helping them to be able to show it to us in the best way possible. Alright, so as we've wrapped up this module, we're going to spend just a second talking about your individual assignments. And in this unit, there's actually two of them. We're anticipating you taking about 90 minutes to complete. The first one, as we've already started, is to complete your KWLH chart. Take the notes on what you learned from this module, jot down a few things in that column, and then go back and describe how you learned what you did. And this will be, I think, a helpful exercise in helping you understand what makes you really able to learn something and what are the most effective ways for you as a learner to hang on to things that you've gotten. And so these are really things on this chart that are up to you. There's no right or wrong answers, but we hope it's a good exercise. It might be a sort of a chart that you would like to use with students as you work with them through what they know, what they want to know, what they've learned, and how they've learned it. And your second assignment is to take one of your classroom objectives from a recent unit or lesson and create an accompanying language objective that complements it. Consider the level of your ESL student that you're working with, and then incorporate vocabulary and language functions. So, take an objective maybe from this week or next week's assignment, and then try to find a way of incorporating a language objective into that. Okay, and as you write that language objective for your classroom as the second assignment for this module, let's do a little practice again to help you review it. If you want to write a language objective for your ESL students, you need to decide what the key vocabulary, the key concept words, and other academic words that might need to be understood by the student in order to accomplish your content objective. And then, when you're writing your language objective, consider the language functions that are related to the topic of the lesson. For example, will the student be describing or explaining or comparing, or will they need to chart information? So consider these aspects as you're looking into writing your language objective. And finally, when we get together, we're going to have a couple of group activities where we'll talk about the difference between BICS and CALP to review those two concepts. And we'll also spend a little time on content and language objective writing to make sure you have a good solid understanding of how to write each kind of them and how they're different from each other and how they complement each other. So we'll look forward to meeting you during the face-to-face to accomplish these tasks.